Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked with Lisa Hall last month when we were at a brewery in Texas. Today we're expanding our show to include more than just FedRAMP, but before we get to that, I want to mention we're sitting in a room, we're all sitting together in a room in sunny San Diego, California at HyperConnect 2024 with our special guest, Eric from Nutanix, and we've got some beers. What are we drinking today, Eric?
Beer.
Beer. What do we have here?
I was like Firestone Walker Brewing Company 805, California Blonde.
This is pretty exciting. Yeah, Firestone Walker is a local brewery. They're really known for the hoppy beers, and if anybody follows this show, they know that I really like hoppy beers.
No.
This is not going to be one of the hoppier beers. This is a blonde ale, which is usually a little more delicate on the palate for those who don't like the hops. So, but still, should be a very good beer.
Okay.
So, and if anybody at any point gets confused about who's Kayne, who's Tom, who's Eric, just remember this. Tom wears pants. Kayne has hair. Eric wears pants and has hair. So that's an easy way to just separate.
That's a good differentiator. Yeah. I like that. It's fantastic. Yeah. All right, well, let's get into these and see. Look what they gave us for props. Isn't this fun?
Isn't? Yeah. We're moving up in the world. We have a handle.
Yeah. We're going to see our relative beer pouring skills. I've been getting better at this. Tom's been teaching me. We'll see if I can actually. Now, how much of a head are you going to put on that, Tom?
Tom. You know what? Most beers are poured with the intent to have the head on them, believe it or not.
So there we are. See, right?
Yeah.
Managed a little bit.
So let's look at the color first of all. I hope everybody has a beer that wants a beer.
Goodness me.
But
it's very yellow.
Like and it looks like a typical sort of American beer, right? I mean, it's definitely not hazy, not a lot of character in the color. It smells like a beer, grainy.
It's kind of got a bread smell to it.
Yeah, it's very grainy.
Bread and a little bit of
Eric just wants to drink the beer, I think.
I can't get anything else off this. It's kind of got nothing, but I do appreciate this is deep enough for me not to get my nose stuck in, which is fantastic.
I think we better taste this. Eric's going to
we'll see how this goes.
Leave the stage. So, as a little sweetness, I don't know who else is drinking. Is anybody else drinking 805 out here? Yeah. There's that little bit of sweetness to it, which is kind of typical with these beers.
It's very watery. I'll say that. This does not have a strong
Well, you should have tried the Coors Light if you wanted water. That's the one that's very watery. But I would say this has some character. This has, there's a certain flavor that almost all blondes have, and I don't know if I can actually distinguish or give it a name, but it has a very distinguishable flavor, and you kind of taste it on the backside of the swallow.
Nope, still tastes like beer, Tom. Still, it's not offensive, though. This is kind of a nice thing.
Yeah.
Offensive is a good thing to avoid.
Most beers are offensive.
Eric, did you try it? Did you try some? What do you think?
I did. With all this talk, though, I wish you'd have pre-beered me before the show started.
Yeah, there we go. So what are you getting in terms of flavor off this, Eric? Anything?
It's beer.
All right.
We need to have him on more often. I can relate to this.
It tastes good. It's cold. It's
okay, well now,
that's
good is a strong term there. Okay, fantastic. Well, as you know, we're going to review these at the end of the show, and we'll see. Tom, might need another, so somebody might have to do him a solid and
I'll put it down for now.
Several more throughout the course of the episode. That will make this so much better. But before we got onto the show, we talked about what we're going to talk with Eric, and I want to start a conversation today about frameworks and about controls, because I think we've got a pretty good mix of auditors in the room, a mix of compliance experts, a mix of cybersecurity people. And so, Eric, how do you really balance adherence with various cybersecurity frameworks when we've got this evolving modern threat landscape and you still have to design controls that both satisfy the auditors as well as the practical needs of your security team?
Well, no offense to the auditors in the room. You don't design your controls to the auditors. You design your controls to protecting the business. And then you align them to the frameworks and the auditor's requirements as you need. So you can't approach this problem as thinking about what frameworks do I align to and how do I build a program around this specific framework, because what you're going to do is drive yourself into a scenario where you're aligning to a generic framework of controls, and you are a unique individual. You're a purpose-built company. So you have to design the controls that meet the needs of your business, and then you need to very skillfully map those back to what those frameworks are trying to achieve. Remembering that compliance frameworks are supposed to be a guideline and not necessarily the rule to follow, if you will. Because there's a way to navigate through various sets of, complementary or mitigating controls to meet standards. You can meet standards several different ways. And to me, it's always just important for people to look at their business and to understand their business is unique, and then meet those controls through that perspective, and then have a good relationship with your auditors to ensure they understand that as well.
Yeah, I always think of the approach that compliance should be sort of a waypoint on your way to best practice. So if you're designing your controls only to meet a compliance platform, you're missing the bigger picture of best practice. Again, kind of to what you were discussing, Eric, is build your controls in such a way where your control is applicable to your business and can be spread across multiple frameworks. Because most frameworks are going to have that waypoint that you have to hit, but it shouldn't be what you target. It should be something you pass.
So then, Eric, I want to ask your hot take on common control frameworks or similar, where it's kind of a generic amalgam of controls. We've seen a lot of these. There are a lot of common control frameworks out there. Do you think that those are actually useful in practice, or do they have to be bespoke on a per business basis?
I think that they are useful to provide companies and cybersecurity teams a roadmap toward compliance in their area, or to the standard, or to their industry, or to whatever the regulatory body is. I think the mistake that gets made is too much reliance on what those frameworks are and what they're intended to kind of convey. So ultimately, you need to look at these common standard frameworks that come out and look at them for what they are, and that's a roadmap toward bettering your business and lowering your business risk, not a roadmap towards making an auditor happy. And then you get that naturally if you apply them correctly. One of the things that we always say at Nutanix is that, if you build the security into the product, the compliance will come naturally with it, right? So as you build product and you do things like secure design by principle, and you add in governance as you go, compliance standards will come with it. And that's not because you're perfectly aligning with standards as you go. It's because the intent of the standard is generic and the application is specific. And that's really where you achieve goodness, through aligning to those, in my opinion.
No, I don't disagree at all. I mean, you and I have both been in the auditor chair at one point in our career, and you certainly know that there are organizations out there that aren't particularly mature and are struggling to understand where they should go. That's the best entry point for common controls, in my opinion, because it helps them understand, to your point, what's the roadmap and where do I need to get to. But as you mature, those common controls should become very specific to your business and your implementation, which means you should never take a common control and say, I can never change that control. I can't evolve the language around that control. Certainly you're not gonna change the intent of the control, the generic intent, but you are gonna change it to meet your specific need. So if you're in a position where you're struggling to understand where you start, by all means, take in a common control framework. It's going to help you tremendously, and I think we're even developing one ourselves. That will help you guys significantly if that's where you sit. Yeah. But again, don't be afraid to customize that to meet your specific business goals and objectives.
All right, and then just kind of a final question on control frameworks, because they keep changing, right? We've seen NIST change over time, whether it's 853 or 171 or NIST CSF. Or Center for Internet Security, right? They periodically release updates. How do those updates really long-term affect the evolution of your controls at your organization? And any thoughts to like how to manage that upgrade life cycle?
You want me to start? Can I start?
Go for it, Tom. I think we can break from tradition.
Well, here's my thought is typically, especially when you're talking about government control set frameworks, right? So NIST, they are flagging behind what we already know is best practice generally. So, think about, we are all struggling with AI right now, right? We understand that we have to have controls around AI, and we're developing and building our controls. And in many ways, we are informing the frameworks on where they need to go whenever they catch up. So by the time those regulations actually change, I think the best CISOs out there, the ones that sit in the chair and really understand the emerging threat landscape, I think they already have controls largely built out. Will they have 15 degrees of difference with the ultimate NIST control set or high trust control set or whatever you're dealing with? Sure. But that 15% is going to be a lot easier to solve for than if you were just waiting for the regulatory body to come out and tell you what you should be doing. The threat landscape evolves much quicker than the governments and the framework bodies out there can meet the challenge. That's my thought.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Tom, but also, I mean, you was talking about the speed at which these updates come out compared to what we know that the industry trends are already doing. And a mature program probably is already meeting the strides before that framework changes. However, you also have situations like if anyone in the room has ever tried to align to a federal standard, let's say like FedRAMP or STIGs or anything of that nature, you've quickly realized that the people writing the standards have probably never been in a data center. So, you've also have the complication around iterations that just don't make sense either. That's why I always encourage people that are in this industry to keep an eye on these regulatory bodies and participate in the open comments to make sure that when they're developing these new standards that we're getting engaged and we're saying that makes no sense, that doesn't align to this, or you're forgetting about these types of things, because the people that write the standards can't know everything.
Yeah, and I think you make a really valuable point there, Eric, on the ability to publicly comment on evolving regulatory change. And it's like big businesses, the major corporations certainly have lobbyists that can influence the track of a given regulatory standard, but there's still an opportunity for those smaller companies to still contribute and be part of the conversation in a meaningful way, because there is the tendency of especially large businesses, to pull the ladder up behind themselves, right? To say, well, we saw that we created a whole bunch of regulatory heartache for everybody, so here's a control that we're recommending, or a law that we're recommending, which they can comply to, but their competition certainly can't. I think that we have to look at ourselves in the ability to make those public comments, whether it's Federal Register or similar entity, and be able to say, this will damage our business, or this will cause decreased competition in the marketplace because of the regulatory burden associated with it.
And that's a huge point, right? It is the burden that is sometimes accompanies these changes, right? So is it even feasible for lines of business to meet changes in standards? And that often happens, right? The operationalizing, the vision of the operationalization of a change is kind of lost sometimes on the bodies making the changes. So it is important that we get engaged in those scenarios. You can't really complain about it if you had a chance to change it and you didn't. But also, I think the combined voice of the industry that's actually making these things a reality is important.
So I agree completely. Just one point I'll put out there is, your voice is important, but you also have multiple places you can apply your voice. One is through the comments, and I really encourage you to do that. I do that. Some of those documents are awful to read, but really applicable to what we do every day. So go out and read them and understand what's going to be asked of you and get your voice heard. But another way you can get your voice heard is a lot of the auditors that we work with have a voice with whatever the board is for that regulatory platform. So for instance, if you're going through FedRAMP, a lot of 3PAOs sit on a CSP advisory board back to the FedRAMP PMO. That's a great place to get your voice heard as well. And those guys have a direct line in. So don't be afraid to voice back to your audit partners where you think they have a voice. They probably do.
Yeah. And don't think that you're too small of a company to get involved, because you're not.
That's very true. Well, I want to pivot our conversation next to contractual requirements, and this is one of those hot button issues for, I think, everybody here on stage. And I was sitting in a session earlier today that was talking about the tendency of sales to tell the security organization after the fact, hey, by the way, we've signed a contract and now you have a new obligation that you have to meet contractually. And Eric, I know this has happened to you, Tom. I know this has actually happened
Never
to all of
happens
us.
to me.
But
Never.
walk us through an example, Eric, if you can, of where your go-to-market organization has committed you to contractual obligations that might not be realistic with your current operational stance, and how do you balance that conversation?
You stop letting them sign things. It's a great question, because oftentimes the drive of revenue, sales, and quota tend to overshadow the operationalization or the ability to meet the terms in a contract, or to meet the security or the notification or the operationalization of what you have to do in that contract with the customer. And quite honestly, the only real way to deal with that is to put significant enough controls in your environment to where they're not allowed to do it. But we all know that doesn't necessarily always happen. So what you hope for is you hope for a scenario where you can either educate or influence the process well enough that you don't get signed up for things that there's no possible way to operationalize. It happens to us, but I think that we're kind of in control of that scenario a little bit, depending on the business, I'm sure. But it's really important for us to cut that off before it happens, because it's a dangerous spot to be in.
And just to give an example, before we started recording, he was sharing a story with me of a company that has, I think he said, a strict 12-hour notification
I've seen that, yeah.
on an incident, and how do you deal with something? Because to me, that's crazy town. You can't even make a materiality determination within 12 hours. Incident response is still not probably even finished an investigative phase. How do you handle that?
No, so that's a really good question. Quite frankly, you define incident. And really what this boils down to is that oftentimes we find customers, they request basically the moon in an agreement, and they're willing to walk home with a keychain. You have to negotiate where that line is, but to understand that everything that you negotiate out in a contract like that is you have to have a goal of mitigating your own risks and their risks, right? Because the customers bring a risk to the table as well. Now, does a customer need to know within 12 hours of any incident in the company? I've seen that. I think Sarah, we've seen, Sarah's my customer trust person at the company. I think we've seen like 2-hour notices. We've seen really ridiculous numbers before, where you have to tell us within 2 hours that any incident occurs. Well, unfortunately, and people need to understand this, and even maybe in the room, if you're involved in doing this, understand this as well, no one can operationalize that. But even if you could, the definition of incident is a problem. What does that mean? And how does that infringe upon the rights of the other customers that you may be servicing, right? So say I have an incident that involves some sort of breach within a cloud service, right? And that cloud service houses 500 customers. Well, what makes this customer more important than the other 499 in terms of notification? Why is their notification so much more of a risk that I need to manage than the other 499? And what information do I give up in that notification that the 499 do not get to be a part of? So you have to really look at that as a software provider and a software company to try to negotiate out those terms with customers to understand the risks they're trying to mitigate, but also help them understand that you have your own regulatory requirements and customers you have to watch out for as well.
You know, it's interesting, where we started this conversation was talking about how do we keep sales in line, essentially. Like, how do we keep sales in line? And we happen to have some of those folks here. And, you know, from my perspective, a good sales team understands when they're out of their own depth. And certainly I see that with our own team, and I'm not blowing smoke there. Later I'll blow some smoke probably for you. But the idea here is sales needs to understand where they're comfortably on their skis and when they're in a position where they're over their skis. And the idea here is you engage as partners between sales and information security, and understand that looks different at scale, but I've successfully made it through that scaling. But you engage to have those conversations, and you make sure they understand the red flag areas or the warning sort of keywords that exist in contracts that they should be looking out for. And quite frankly, we have sort of a triad that occurs when we're answering those kinds of contracts, right? We have a legal arm that we reach out to as well. We have sales that can handle a bunch of that. They understand where to push back just a native common items. And then we have us, which I get escalated to on a number of those questionnaires. So building that trust between those three different layers is pretty critical in helping them understand where you want to be involved and where they can be comfortable with the language. And then I'll also just point out that I think it has become pretty typical for organizations to put things into contracts that they know are going to get negotiated out. And in some cases, it gets to be a little ridiculous. Like, you know that they wouldn't even agree to that if they were asked to do it, right? Yep. So you have to be comfortable redlining those documents. You have to be comfortable pushing back and saying, this creates too much liability for my organization. And as information security people, we should be in a position to understand risk to our own organization above all things is something we have to look out for. So don't be afraid to do that.
And to the original question, Tom brings up a good point, but just to round it out, because I made a comment about defining incident, but I didn't explain what I meant by that. And what I mean by that is sometimes in these negotiations, you gain flexibility in the definition that you put to incident. When does something become an incident as opposed to an event? When is it an event? When does it escalate to an incident? And what's your process around that? And oftentimes that gives you enough flexibility to negotiate those terms. Now, I'm not the expert on this, and I'm staring at the person that is out of the corner of my eye here, glaring at me. But the point of it is that she's taught me well, is the point of it. But ultimately, you have to understand that you're meeting the risks and the requirements of everybody, right? Your business and the customer as well. And sometimes you just have to teach them why you can't do something.
So what I'm hearing is there also needs to probably be a better partnership with legal, because something that's running as an undercurrent here, I think I heard clapping in the room for partnership with
Is there one lawyer in the back?
But I think there does need to be that good partnership, because the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States, actually has definitions associated with materiality, but also for what we can disclose. And the question that, kind of a follow-on question I was thinking about here, is there a risk of market manipulation by having that advanced notification of a data breach? Like, if you get something 2 hours before everybody else in your supply chain does, and that information is distributed widely, doesn't that pose the threat of actually people shorting your stock?
That's exactly why you can't do it. I mean, you can't, that's exactly why we couldn't, like me, myself, and my team, we could not agree to terms like that, because it is just absolutely untenable to get into a situation where you are beholden to a regulatory authority like the SEC in some sort of materiality determination of an incident, but you actually have signed up to notify a customer or an individual in advance of that. And that just creates a scenario that is just, an unfathomable amount of business risk to get into. And it's also a lot of business risk on that customer, and they probably don't think about it this way. But if I were to do that and give that information to them, they now know something that they can't do anything with, and if they did, they're in a lot of trouble as well. So it's really protecting both sides in it. It really is.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And just as for those of you who are watching the recording on YouTube, if you're enjoying this conversation, want to see more about my choice and my ability to actually find a beer that I like, please do ring the bell and make this part of your weekly or your monthly routine. And I think also Tom and Eric are running light on their beers, so if there's anybody in the audience who wants to...
I'm stretching it.
Okay, we can get you another one, I'm certain. Both of you, actually. So the next topic I want to move on to is security questionnaires, because as CISOs here, we've all dealt with vendor security questionnaires, VSQs, and I think we can agree the intent, at least initially, behind vendor security questionnaires was to successfully manage third-party risk. It's a great idea. I think we all would agree, like, it'd be nice to manage the risk of our supply chains. But critics have said that they're overly formulaic and they can be really static and just kind of a check-the-box mentality where we're not actually managing our risks, we're just doing due diligence and nobody actually reads these things. So, Eric, do you think that VSQs, vendor security questionnaires, reduce risk in some measurable way? Or is it just about checkbox compliance? Oh, they're going double-fisted up here, too. Well done.
It's like
Thank
Christmas.
you.
I mean,
so good.
We're talking about security questionnaires, you might as well. Do I think security questionnaires reduce risk? No. Next question.
So what do they cost, though, in terms of organizational capability and damage?
They cost an incredible amount of overhead, and and people power and expense to process manage, not just answering them, but dealing with them from a vendor due diligence program perspective. So think about it. Think about, and I don't know who in the audience has answered the questionnaires as opposed to emailed them out. Those of you that email out questionnaires, stay in your seats. But it's, the issue really with them is that we're not using more often than not, like to your point in the lead-in, we don't use those questionnaires to evaluate risk. We use those questionnaires generically to basically satisfy a diligence program that probably is a control from a different standard that we're applying or adhering to. And I don't think that those questionnaires almost ever ask the right questions. And I think that there's going to be a question here in a minute that'll let me make a point on that. So I won't jump ahead.
All right. Tom, I know that you spend absolutely no time on vendor security questionnaires at all, my friend, right?
It's literally why I'm looking at retail as a potential job hop.
Yep.
The reality is we have all of these things that somewhere along the line in industry we've agreed upon we should do because it's good for everybody. We have things like SOC 2 reports. We have things like SIG lights. We have things like cakes. These are all standardized ways to check on controls and check on the approach from a security perspective, yet nobody accepts them for what they are. So from my perspective, I'd like to just be done doing SOC 2s if I'm going to keep doing information security questionnaires. Because I have a third-party attestation that we're meeting the controls that we say we have in place, but nobody accepts that. They want it, it's another checkbox, but nobody is really reading it and accepting that this means that I'm beholden in meeting the controls that I have in place.
No one reads it.
So what limitations are those really causing in the industry where, as Tom says, we send a SOC 2 or you send a SOC 2 type 2, and people still send you a 5,000 question questionnaire? Like, is there a point still in having a SOC 2?
Well, no, I'd like for them all to go away. I could buy really nice things with all that budget. So the problem is that the people that are basically prosecuting these kind of questionnaires and looking over them to establish business risk don't understand the instruments that they're asking for. So for example, a SOC 2. You ask a company for a SOC 2, is that a static set of prescriptive controls? Or can they add to and subtract from that? Can they modify what they're actually testing to or what the controls are? Sure they can. They can actually change what they're doing, which puts you in a position where what is SOC 2 measuring? Well, it's measuring the specific thing they chose to measure, not necessarily a standard that you want to be measured. Now, another great example of this, and I'm going to give credit to Nicole, the person that runs my compliance. I didn't come up with this on my own. But another great thing that she pointed out to me is looking at things like, FedRAMP authorizations, which I know is your favorite topic. But in those scenarios, you're only really testing a third of the controls per year and a 3-year cycle to test everything. So, is looking at someone's FedRAMP accreditation at a point in time really showing you the true layout of what environment they have and what the controls are in place? No. Because if you know that this year you tested IR procedures and you tested logging and all this other stuff, keep the same auditor. Next year, you're not looking at those controls. You're looking at something else. But somebody might look at an authorization and say, I know what this means. It's very prescriptive. I know where this puts me, and I know my risk profile from it. And I would argue that if you think like that, you need to understand the instruments better. And things like that in SOC 2 are really good examples why diligence questionnaires and requiring some of these attestations don't necessarily paint the picture that I think people think they paint.
And yet they're always consistently requested for, demanded as part of contracts.
Without
a
a
reason
doubt.
to get locked out of a contract. Tom,
Yep.
any further thoughts from you on the limitations
do I
of
have
looking at
thoughts,
SOC
but
2s?
we have a short amount of time. I mean, the
And
reality
we do want to
is,
do audience questions too,
the
right?
reality
So-
is until we get to some agreement on what are the things that are most important that we need to attest to, and we get to some agreement on what is the format that we deliver, that proof or those answers or whatever you want to call it, we're going to continue to have these conversations. The problem is there's just way too many methodologies, way too many questions, way too many delivery mechanisms. I mean, there's a whole industry, right, where you can build trust pages, but people still don't go to those. We've had trust pages, and then we still have to deliver all that same documentation through another methodology. So there's really multiple problems here, and they're just piling on top of each other. So I think the right approach at some point is to get to the point where we have an agreement that this is what's important. And to Eric's point, it's really not, do you encrypt, right? It's a much more involved set of questions and answers. So I think we need to evolve that, and I think we have to evolve the delivery methodology so we can get to something that is repeatable underneath that. And we're a long ways away from that. So we're going to continue to talk about this for years.
But to play devil's advocate to you for a second,
Sure.
Do you not believe that standardizing on a set of questions for an industry would be only addressing the industry you standardize to? And my point there is that, if I'm doing vendor due diligence on Hyperproof, then I know that I need to ask specific questions around encryption, delivery, what's the, what kind of security do you have around your SaaS products, what data center is my data in, like how is it stored, et cetera. Those are specific things that I would ask to that. Now, if I go and I'm buying Windows on-prem, I don't care about a data center or things like that. So it's pretty difficult kind of to get to that. Maybe an idea around a prescriptive set of questions everybody agrees to that has, a choose your own adventure vibe to it. I dated myself with that one.
Yeah,
I like the reference though. But ultimately what we're talking about is managing business risks effectively.
Yeah.
And I think a friend of mine, another CISO, has pointed out, what are the 10 questions on the questionnaire that would kill a deal? And are there even 10 where you'd actually say, no, we don't want your business? Because ultimately we're trying to manage risks to our own business and risks to our supply chain when we get into contracts. Where do you set that balance, Eric? Like, do you have those hard line questions where you go, well, you haven't updated your antivirus since Windows 95? Is that a deal killer? If it's an all cloud-based solution? Like, where are those hard, bright lines, and do they exist so that we could have those industry-specific questions?
How vulnerable do I be? So
have another beer and we'll find out.
I should finish it. Should those lines exist? Yes. Do they exist in your mind? Of course. Do they exist in reality as you're going through a procurement process and things are real time and operational and active, and you've got lawyers looking at sales contracts and procurement people dealing with money and somebody trying to cut a PO and all this going on? No. Does it happen? Should it happen? Yes. Do you try hard? Yes. Does it always work? No. But I would argue still that oftentimes the wrong questions are being asked, which to me leads you down to wrong conclusions. So if I go and buy, widget A today, and I request somebody's SIG, and I get their ISO and their SOC 2 and all of that stuff, did I learn anything from it? No, probably not. Because it has to be, what questions do I need to ask that vendor to protect my business? And my business is unique to me. So all the way back to the beginning of our conversation around customized controls, the way a business is unique and standard frameworks are generic, the same thing really applies here, right? So SIGs tend to be generic. The SOC 2s, ISOs, they tend to be looked at as generic instruments. How does it protect my business?
I think that's great feedback. The one place where I see some maybe dissonance between what you're saying and what I'm experiencing is I never see anybody give me a question that they couldn't find on a SIG Lite, other than maybe in the privacy space, because SIG Lites aren't great on the privacy space. But in general, if you just reference my SIG Lite, you'd get the answers that you're looking for. One thing I'd like to point out is I have put hard lines in the sand quite a bit in my career. I did one today with AJ, I think in the audience somewhere, but where I said essentially if I can't get a live person to talk to and they can't give me attestation, then I'm not particularly interested in giving that vendor much of a leeway, right? To me, the answer when you can't get your questions answered through a format or whatever. You build that relationship. And I'll even put a plug in that we should be building relationships with our vendors anyway. We shouldn't have just a sort of flat file transactional relationship with vendors. We should understand them, their goals. We should understand how they view our data and where that data goes and all of that. So build those relationships. But in the absence of being able to ask questions and get a third-party attestation, I better have that relationship, because if you don't have it, I don't know what you could possibly base a relationship on. So to me, that's the only way you can sort of get by out of this. And I think, really, Eric, what you're saying is if you can understand how they are protecting your business overall and have those more meaningful conversations about security and all the things that you care about based upon your specific business, I think you're going to be in a better position in general. And I think that's right.
Yeah, and basically to summarize what you said, which I agree with, is that GRC is not a transactional thing. It's a living, breathing thing that should be iterated over and built, as opposed to a transaction that happens with, I want your thing, give me your questions, okay, here's your money. And that, unfortunately, is the checkbox aspect of what we're talking about, and that does not really add value to businesses at all.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing ultimately is it's about building relationships, about building strong internal lines of communication, and then having a customized approach towards managing and reducing business risks.
Understand your business. Understand your business and what you're trying to use in that process.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the next thing we need to understand is how we're going to rate these beers. And
before we even re-rate them,
we
should acknowledge what happened. We were running low on beer, and magically, the beer fairy showed up.
It's kind of nice, actually.
And I didn't get just one more beer. I got two.
I got two, and I'm not drinking.
It is not every day. It is not every day your boss delivers you a beer on stage. So I just wanted to point out how monumental that was. So now we can rate it.
All right, cool. So yeah, and I want to leave a little minute of time for audience questions after we wrap the live show. But Eric, what we do is we do a 10-point scale for beer. And one is the Cinnamon Sticky Bun Ale, which had a great kawaii can. It was very cute. I was very sick.
It was disgusting.
And a 10 is something that Tom would actually enjoy, and I'd probably not enjoy at all.
So that one bad, 10 good.
That is a completely incomprehensible scale.
I knew that. I knew that. So I was trying to simplify it. One good, or one bad, 10 good. That's what we're going for.
The funny thing is, you're more of a hoppy kind of IPA guy. I'm actually more of a Pilsner or lighter guy.
And this
so
is
I
the
like
805,
I
right?
like blonde ales. I like Pilsners. So for me, this is actually very smooth. It's got a nice after. There's not really a lot of bitter to it. I would order it. I would order it. So I'd probably give it a good, 7, probably. And that's me saying that, I live in Colorado, the land of beer. So you're going to be hard-pressed to get 10s out of me unless it's a Colorado brew.
All right. That's good to know. I like this beer. So I do like hoppy beers. Like the more character, the more interest in it, unless it's the sticky bun stuff. That's what I tend to like. So in my beer fridge, there's always going to be like 7 different beers, and 5 of them will probably be an IPA of one kind or another. That said, this is a very good blonde ale, and I don't typically drink blonde ales at all. So I think they tend to finish a little odd. So I'm going to rate this quite high. I'm going to give it a 7 as well. That's really unusual for this kind of beer for me. And I'd also say like the back end of once this opens up and you drink it, gets more caramely as you go. And I've really enjoyed how much this beer has opened up over time. I don't know if anybody else has felt the same way as me, but if you did.
So I think, Tom, the difference here is that you're on your second and I'm still on the first eighth of an inch of my first.
Have you even taken a drink?
I have, as a matter of fact. And what I've noticed over time is that this does not age well. This feels like a beer that you need to put a hole in the bottom of the can and a hole in the top of the can and just shotgun it, and perhaps that's the way to get through it quickly.
No, that's Busch Light draft territory. I mean, it's a little better than that.
That sounds a lot like you've had experience doing that. So
that's a whole other story for a different show.
I didn't know you could shotgun wine boxes, but...
Oh, goodness me, yes. That's a whole other conversation. But I'll say this does not age well. This is, at the top of the show, I was going to actually give it a higher rating. Over time, it's oxidized and it's become a little skunky. I'd say.
But you just let it get warm.
It's a bit bitter. It is a little warmer, I'd say, as well. So I'm going to give this, at the top of the show, I would give it a higher number. I'm going to give it a 3. It's not the worst thing we've had, but I would feel insulted to hand this to a friend. I would not have this in my fridge. Then again, unlike, you've got 7 different types of beer. I have 7 different types of wine, at least at home. But that's the difference, right?
That's right. Difference is good.
And with that, that's all for today. So if you think you know a beer that I'd like, or if you've got a FedRAMP or other compliance question for us, please drop a link in the comments on YouTube or on LinkedIn. And remember to follow our LinkedIn and YouTube pages for live interviews with cybersecurity professionals.